Welcome to our final lecture of the BU Institute for Philosophy and Religion's Spring 2024 lecture series on the question, Can Virtue Be Taught? I am David DeCosimo. I'm Associate Professor here at BU and Director of BU Institute for Philosophy and Religion. Those who have been with us for a few lectures know that the Institute was founded over 50 years ago by the theologians, philosophers, and scholars of religion who taught Martin Luther King Jr. as a graduate student here at BU. And it was founded on the premise that one of our recent speakers at the Institute expressed in this way. So in the fall, we welcomed Professor Zena Hitz. And Professor Hitz, in her book Lost in Thought, says the following: the amateur's fundamental human questions are almost always the best starting place for scholarly work. And that proposition and that claim that the best version of the intellectual life is one lived in the authenticity and the immediateness of the lives that we actually live and the questions that actually come to us as we live alongside one another and grapple with what it means to be a human, that these questions ought to be at the center of any education that's worth being called higher. And so as we enter into our final lecture today, I am delighted for us to start to think together about a tension that has hovered over the entire series. And that is the tension between, on the one hand, a vision of the university as a site for a certain sort of ethical formation, and on the other hand, the reality or claim made by many and with much merit to it that to be a university requires being the sort of place that on the one hand doesn't impose any one ethical vision over another because it's in the business of investigating which ethics are worth regarding as true and seeking to live out, and that the proposition of the university requires the freedom to engage with ideas and consider practices that many of us regard as not merely offensive, but in some cases reprehensible and deeply wrong. And I can think of no better guide to try to bring these many threads together in our final lecture than our guest today, Dr. Toni Alimi. Dr. Alimi is Klarman Postdoctoral Fellow at Cornell University in the departments of Philosophy and Religion. And beginning next fall, he'll be an assistant professor in Cornell's Distinguished Philosophy Department. Dr. Alimi received his A.B. in Religion, cum laude, from Princeton University, and a master's in the study of religion from Yale Divinity School, summa cum laude. He earned his Ph.D. also from Princeton in religion in 2021, and while at Princeton, he was a Graduate Prize Fellow in the University Center for Human Values and won the university-wide Graduate School Teaching Award. Dr. Alimi has published several articles in journals in religious studies and religious ethics, and his first book, Slaves of God, Augustine and Other Romans on Religion and Politics, is forthcoming from Princeton University Press this August. That book examines the surprisingly neglected topic of the place of slavery in Augustine's thought. And it argues that we cannot rightly understand central dimensions of Augustine's work, from his accounts of law, politics, and ethics to his conception of God, apart from sustained attention to his understanding of slavery as a natural and non-problematic feature of creaturely existence. To quote the distinguished scholar of late antiquity and former BU professor of religion, Paula Fredrickson, with penetrating clarity, Dr. Alimi traces the ways that the idea of slavery functions and even features in Augustine's construction of humanity's relationship with the divine. Slaves of God is a morally lucid examination of this baneful social institution and of Augustine's complex endorsement of it. Dr. Alimi is currently at work on a second book, tentatively entitled Slavery: A Philosophical History. Our politics and the university itself are in many ways predicated on the stultifying assumption that each of us can be placed into a box, that knowing our views on X is enough for someone to know our views on A through Z. Unfortunately, many of us are only too eager not only to put others in such boxes, but to get neatly sorted and packaged ourselves. We take comfort in being boxed together with those whom we think are the right sort of people. Dr. Alimi, in contrast, is a box breaker, someone who tries to resist and tries to help us resist, allowing others to do our thinking for us. He is, in my view, one of the most promising young scholars of religion, ethics, and politics in his generation. And I'm delighted to welcome him to BU and to hear his thoughts on the provocative question, what if the truth is bad?
Thank you, Professor DeCosimo, for that really generous introduction. And thank you also for inviting me here to BU. Thank you all for being here. I'm really excited, for us to think together about these matters. I should say, my wife did her PhD at BU's School of Theology. So before we were married, I'd often visit her here. I have fond memories of visiting the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum and going to the Boston Symphony Orchestra. So it's really nice to be back and lovely to be with you all. Given the auspices of my talk, I thought I had better say something about philosophy and something about religion. The philosophy, Socrates, Plato, Neoplatonism, Suarez, Nietzsche, and Russell will come soon enough. So let me begin with religion, a statement of faith. I believe that almost anyone who has access to basic goods, such as opportunities to practice religion, parents who love them and have the resources to raise them in a stable environment, healthy food, clean air and water, safe spaces to play, communities of trust, schooling, healthcare and transportation, and a stable civil society will be able to carve out for herself a more or less decent life. I believe that in wealthy countries like our own, most of the people who are least well off, the homeless, the indigent, the imprisoned, suffer largely because of choices we, the broader public, have made, rather than because they possess some inherent deficiency. And I believe that we have an obligation to reorganize ourselves to ensure that those whose lives are most precarious are made better off. In other words, I disagree with the eugenicists who say that many people, perhaps in virtue of their race or ethnicity or parental wealth or other factors beyond their control and ours, are destined for destitution, squalor, precarity, or violence. In this respect, I am a good liberal. My disagreements with the eugenicists are fundamentally moral. I am committed to the moral equality of all humans, and it seems to me that they are not. But my disagreements are also factual. I don't think they've provided good evidence for their views. That said, I'm an aspiring scholar, and one thing that scholars pride ourselves on is our ability to engage with the possibility that we're wrong. One of the great 20th century philosophers, Bertrand Russell, criticized one of the great medieval philosophers, Thomas Aquinas, for falling short of this standard. Russell says that Aquinas, quote, does not, like the Platonic Socrates, set out to follow the argument wherever it leads. He is not engaged in inquiry, the result of which it is impossible to know in advance. Before he begins to philosophize, he already knows the truth. It is declared in the Catholic faith. If he can find apparently rational arguments for some parts of the faith, so much the better. But if not, he just can fall back on revelation. The finding of arguments for a conclusion given in advance is not philosophy, but special pleading. I cannot therefore feel that he deserves to be put on a level with the best philosophers, either of Greece or of modern times. So says Russell. I suspect that at least one person in this room is unhappy with Russell's reading of Aquinas. At any rate, even if Russell had gotten Aquinas right, it seems to me that he was holding Aquinas to too high a standard no one, including Russell himself, could possibly meet. But Russell's criticism captures this ideal that scholars cherish and claim, right? A willingness to follow the arguments and follow the evidence to whatever they lead. Seems to me, however, that this ideal forces us to consider a question. What if the evidence and what if the arguments lead to bad truths? That's the topic of my talk this evening. Here's my plan, which you can find at the top of the handout. So first, I want to give you a case for why this question matters. And then I'll try to convince you that bad truths are possible, right? If you think that there's no such thing as a bad truth or they couldn't be possible, I try to convince you that they could be. Third, I'll try to offer a theory about what a bad truth is. Fourth, I'll consider one response to bad truths, borrowing from an analogous political strategy offered by Socrates in Plato's Republic. And I'll explain why I don't think his answer can work for us. Fifth, I'll survey some strategies that others have offered for how we might make room for bad truths, protecting free speech, cultivating the virtue of courage, and cultivating the virtue of intellectual humility. I think that these strategies are praiseworthy, but also limited. So I'll discuss what I think today's scholars are most afraid of when it comes to bad truths, and why I don't think free speech, courage, and intellectual humility are sufficient to address those fears, though they may be necessary. To make my case, I'll think through the example of John DiIulio and his 1990s research on superpredators. Seventh, taking my cue from the DiIulio example, I'll suggest 3 more strategies for responding to bad truths. I'm a philosopher, so I won't solve any problems. But hopefully, the strategies that I suggest can help illumine something about the relationship between the academy and the broader society. And hopefully they can help us think more clearly about this problem of bad truths. Most of all, this really is my aim, to try and think more clearly about these issues, and I'm really eager to draw on your wisdom in doing so. So hopefully we'll have time to do that in the Q&A. So let's jump in. So here's my case for why we need to think about bad truths. It's actually pretty simple. It seems to me that there are only 3 possible approaches that you could have to bad truths. Right? So the first is you could ignore them. The second is you could mishandle them. And the third is you could handle them well. Those are the only 3 possibilities that occurred to me, but if you have a different one, please suggest it. So I'm going to try to convince you that the first 2 strategies are no good. So if you ignore bad truths, if we ignore bad truths, then scholars leave ourselves open to the accusation that we aren't willing to face facts that we don't like, and that undermines our credibility. And for a host of reasons, this is something that scholarship can't avoid, not least of which because we depend on the public dollar for our continued existence. Right? So second, we could mishandle bad truths, but if we do so, we'll do bad scholarship, and worse still, people could get hurt, as I'll argue later on. So that just leaves a third option, handle bad truths well. This is, of course, easier said than done, and that's precisely why we have to think about the question carefully. If we don't, we won't be able to execute the third option. We'll default to the first or the second, and those aren't any good. So it's a simple case, but there it is. Of course, what I've said presumes that there could be bad truths, and perhaps the concept of a bad truth sounds like an oxymoron to you. If so, you may wittingly or otherwise be in the grip of a medieval Neoplatonic doctrine called the unity of the transcendentals. We don't have to go into the doctrine in too much detail, though for anyone who's interested, I'd be happy to chat more in the Q&A. I'll just give you sort of a basic account. So some medieval philosophers thought that there are some properties that are how they describe as metaphysically fundamental. Right? So Another way to put this is that these properties are coextensive with the very property of being. They help you explain what being is, not just like ways of being. They're not describing different ways of being. So what these philosophers were after wasn't explaining, for instance, why a room can be hot or cold, right? Two ways of being with respect to temperature, or a person could be talking or listening, right? Or a university could be here in Boston versus there in Ithaca, right? So these are all different ways of being. But what they were trying to explain instead is what being itself is in all of those contexts. And some of these philosophers reasoned that being is equivalent to goodness and equivalent to truth. Well, if that's the case, if being is equivalent to both goodness and truth, then goodness and truth are equivalent to each other. And it's not so far from that belief to the belief that there are no bad truths, right, if truth and goodness are equivalent. Bad truth is, in this respect, an oxymoron. So that's a way of rejecting the possibility of bad truths. The problem with this is that there aren't that many people today who endorse the medieval metaphysics of the theories of the unity of the transcendentals. And yet I find that when I talk with people about bad truths, there seems to be this kind of resistance to the idea that goodness and truth could really deviate from one another in the sort of way that I'm suggesting. So I'm curious as to why that is. And again, if you have any thoughts about this, I'd really love to hear them. Some people I encounter have a kind of explicit religious commitment that goes something like this. So for example, some Christians believe, well, that God is the good. And in the New Testament, Jesus describes himself as the truth. Add a bit of Christology, and you're on your way to thinking that the truth and the good are one. But I think even Christians should be open to the possibility of bad truths. Christians believe that there was a fall, and the fall, I think, implies that while everything bad was once untrue, and that everything bad will become untrue, in the time between paradises, things can be both bad and true. And that seems to me the right description of things. What about non-Christians? Well, here I tend to have a kind of Nietzschean view that in modern post-Christian societies, a non-theological commitment to the unity of the transcendentals is a vestige of this old Christian metaphysic that I just described. Without the Christian beliefs, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me, which is part of the reason I'm so surprised that non-Christians tend to still have it. I'd love to know why they do. Anyway, my current view is that the pushback to the idea of bad truths is not actually a belief. It's more like a hope. The hope is that the world is good. We'd prefer to live in a good world than a bad one. And though we know that our world is not fully good, our hope is that it's good. Our hope in its goodness is quite robust. As one of this university's own prophets once said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Okay, so now I owe you an account of what it is for something to be a bad truth. I want to make my case by thinking through a series of examples. So in a moment, I'm going to rattle off 10 claims. The first 8 are what I call potential bad truths. A potential bad truth is something that if it were true, it would be bad. I really want to emphasize the if it were true, because you're going to read these sentences and you're going to think, wait, does he believe that? And I don't, right? It's just if they were true, they'd be bad. It's not the case that I actually believe this. Okay. But the reason I'm going to lead with them is that I think when scholars are worried about bad truths, these are the kinds of things that we have in mind. We're trying to decide what to do with some conclusion, where we think the conclusion could be true, but we don't know what to do with it, because if it were true, it would be bad. So I'm going to give you 8 examples like that, potential bad truths. And then I'm going to give you 2 examples of actual bad truths. So these are things that are really true, and I think they are bad because they really are true. So here are the 10 claims. So first, possessing some virtue precludes possessing some others. So for example, a person can't have the virtue of justice and also have the virtue of mercy, right? It'd be bad if that were true. Here's another one. Monarchies and oligarchies lead to the best political outcomes. For example, they lead to the fairest legal systems, the least national and international violence, and the least violence against minorities, the happiest citizens or subjects, the most prosperity, right? That'd be bad if that were true. Third, there are real situations where some act is both morally required and morally impermissible. So here are some more potential bad truths now in the realm of science or pseudoscience and pseudo-social science. So women are inherently less rational than men. IQ is genetic and necessarily highly determinative of life outcome. There are significant differences in intelligence or other capabilities between races, ethnicities, and nationalities. Are you getting nervous? These are planks for eugenicism, white supremacism, and patriarchy. I don't take any of these claims to be true, but if they were, it would be bad. Here are two more potential bad truths. There's no free will, or we live in a simulation. These claims are less parochial than the previous ones. I looked it up. 12% of professional philosophers believe there's no free will. That's about the same as the percentage of philosophers who accept theism, which is 15%. So it's like it's not a fringe view that there's no free will in philosophy. The simulation hypothesis is not as popular, but it has been defended by pretty prominent philosophers and public figures. All right, so now let's turn to the two actual bad truths. Many of America's founding fathers were racist slave owners. That's one. And here's another one. Martin Luther King Jr. plagiarized part of his Boston University dissertation. So that's 10 claims, 8 potential bad truths, 2 actual bad truths. Enough, I hope, to kind of give a sense for the sort of thing we're talking about and to prepare us to say something about what makes them bad. So here's my best effort at explaining what makes these truths, if they're true, bad. So there are certain things we value: our loved ones, our friendships, our communities, our ideals. And we judge those things that we value to be good. Our valuation of those things is situated in a network of commitments. I think what makes the sentences that I've just said bad is that if they're true, they would undermine or corrode or even defeat some commitment that is connected to one of those goods that we value. So here's an example. Let's take MLK's plagiarism. So King is a moral hero, but plagiarism is a moral failing. And in most cases, it's not even a spectacular failing. It's small and petty and low. That King was capable of this small, low, petty vice mars our appreciation of his moral heroism. Furthermore, since for some people, the judgment of King's heroism is intimately tied to their positive evaluation of the civil rights movement, undermining King's heroism threatens to undermine people's confidence in the good of the civil rights movement. Right? So that's part of what it seems like is going on when people get worried about the fact that King plagiarized in his BU dissertation. Or consider living in a simulation. Right? So we value our loved ones and our relationships and experiences because we take them to be real, not just virtually real. But if we're living in a simulation, then those things are virtual and not real. That would seem to make our lives less rich and meaningful than we hope they are. Or consider the so-called scientific claims about sex and rationality or race and intelligence. If there were stable, significant, and meaningful differences in rationality, intelligence, or other capabilities for autonomy, this might undermine our commitments to racial and sexual equality within a pluralistic state, and so on. So in each case, I think what it is that makes the truth bad is that it opposes some good, whether by corroding it or undermining it or defeating some commitments that are connected to it. That, I think, is a pretty good first pass definition of a bad truth. A bad truth is a truth that opposes goods we value by corroding, undermining, or defeating commitments that are connected to that good. So with this story about what makes truths bad on the table, let's return to the original question. What should we do about them? Here's one answer. The best response to a bad truth is a good lie, a really good lie, a noble lie. In Book 3 of Plato's Republic, Socrates describes a society where each person is sorted into one of 3 classes: the guardians, the soldiers, and the laborers. Socrates says, well, to get people to buy into this social hierarchy, we're going to have to tell them a story about the conditions of their birth. We're going to have to convince them that there's something kind of natural or baked into them that explains why they land where they land in the hierarchy. And so Socrates said, here's a story we could say. We could say that every soul is a mix of earth and some metal. And some souls are mixed with gold, and those people who have those kinds of souls, are fitted to rule. People with souls that are mixed with silver are fitted to help. People with souls that are mixed with iron are fitted to labor. If the people believe this, and they believe that they've been sorted according to their soul's metal, they will be committed to their assigned roles, no matter that the story is false. And so you might think scholars could take a lesson from Socrates here. Sometimes you've just got to lie for the sake of the greater good. I think there are problems with applying the noble lie to academia. So first, it could be the case that lying is inherently wrong. I won't defend that view, but it's worth noting that no less than Augustine, Aquinas, and Kant seem to have thought it. If they're right, then noble lies aren't viable, because no lies are viable. Second, I think there's an important disanalogy between scholarship and politics. In politics, at least on Plato's conception, truth is not a constitutive good. It's an incidental good. What that means is you don't need truth. The truth is not inherent to the success of a political project. The goal of politics is not truth, it's justice. And if, for whatever reason, you can get justice without truth, or the only way to get justice is to do so without truth, then you've got to go for justice rather than truth. You've got to sacrifice truth on the altar of justice. Scholarship doesn't have that luxury, because for us, truth is a constitutive good. What we're doing is not scholarship if we don't aim at knowledge, and part of knowledge is truth. You can't know something that's false. So to set ourselves against the truth by telling noble lies is actually to oppose the very goal of scholarly inquiry. If truth is essential to the purpose of scholarship, then lying about our scholarship or using scholarship to lie is self-defeating. The means and the ends are at odds with one another. So that's why I think we can't avail ourselves of the noble lie strategy. So if not noble lies, then what? I want to now discuss 3 responses that are fairly common to this question, responses that I largely endorse but I think are limited. So one response that you sometimes hear to this question, what should we do with bad truths, is sort of exhorting people to courage in seeking the truth. What is courage? It's a virtue that helps a person overcome fear and danger to persist in doing good. It's common to think of courage sort of largely within the context of like war or battle. So for example, some of you may have read Stephen Crane's Civil War novella, The Red Badge of Courage. The main character, Henry Fleming, the sort of situation in which he needs to develop courage is on the battlefield, right? But the virtue of courage can be found in daily, more everyday settings. Doing what's required of you day in and day out, standing up to a bully, enduring a sickness, right? These are all occasions for courage. And I think this daily sense of courage, this everyday sense of courage, is necessary. It's crucial for scholars to have. It can help us face up to arguments and evidence that point towards bad truths, rather than, say, sweeping them under the rug. Bad truths are, on this conception, an opportunity for us to struggle courageously, not a threat from which we hide like cowards. As a quick aside, I should say, sometimes I worry that this exhortation to courage is indeterminate. Like, people say, just be courageous, but they don't always tell you how to develop courage or communities of courage. And without something more determinate, I think you're left with something like the exhortation, be strong and courageous, which you find in the Bible, in the book of Joshua, which inspiring words, but it's less so if you can't give the promise that comes next in the Bible, which is, for the Lord your God is with you. Like, there's no guarantee that God is on your side as an academic. So if it's just be courage without the God stuff, it's like, well, you know, okay. Okay, so that's the first response, right? Be courageous. Here's a second common response. It's the principle of free speech. So by free speech, I mean 2 things. The first thing I mean is a codified protection in the rules of some society. So for example, you can imagine these protections being encoded legally, like in the US, for the US Constitution. But then you can also imagine them being encoded non-legally. So for example, some universities protect community members' freedom to express ideas as a matter of the rules that govern the university, right? So all of this is part of what I mean by free speech as a codified protection. But I also think it's important to think about free speech as a culture. So we can imagine two countries, A and B. And let's say both countries forbid legislation that would compel or restrict free speech. So both of them protect free speech, in other words. But let's say in the first country, people are generally afraid to speak their mind on certain issues because there are significant social costs to doing so. Or let's say they're practically unable to speak because they're apt to be shouted down, right? So by contrast, country B is marked by robust public disagreement on a wide range of issues. So in this respect, country B would have a strong free speech culture, which country A lacks, right? And so I think both are important. Free speech is a codified protection, and free speech is a culture. Both are necessary for facing up to bad truths. If certain topics are off limits, then, or the social costs of broaching them are too high, then scholars will be strongly incentivized to ignore or avoid those topics, and bad truths will be among the first to go. A third response to bad truths is to insist that scholars cultivate intellectual humility and develop alongside with it practices of caution and patience. So intellectual humility is, as I'm thinking of it, a habit, a virtue, that helps a person not think too highly of their scholarship or intellectual ability or knowledge. Intellectual humility is opposed to arrogance. So imagine a person who, after thinking about the problem of evil, say for all of 5 minutes, determines that she has solved it. Maybe she has, but it's more likely that she just doesn't know enough about the problem yet to know that she hasn't solved it. So intellectual humility helps a person avoid this kind of mistake. The intellectually humble scholar is not too confident in her scholarship, and so she cautions against drawing overbroad conclusions from her work. She patiently waits until she has sufficient information to assert those broader conclusions. So that's one part of intellectual humility. But I think it's also opposed to another vice, one that's a little bit harder to name. I'll call it intellectual timidity. So the vice of timidity is an inability to have sufficient confidence in one's own knowledge, ability, and production. What scholars need is humility, which sort of charts the path between arrogance and timidity. So we need this virtue when it comes to when it comes to talking about scholarship that concerns bad truths. So here's why. So we need to avoid arrogance. So just because you've run a study, say, that produces such and such result, doesn't mean that you're right. Intellectual humility reminds you that you're fallible. You could have gotten things wrong. Your experimental design may not have been perfect. You could have baked in some unfounded or ill-founded assumptions. Intellectual humility says that we should be careful about being overconfident in the results of our work. On the other hand, we also need to avoid timidity, right? So suppose some bad actor, let's say a eugenicist, seizes upon the results of your scholarship to argue for their bad aims. Scholars need to be able to face up to the bad actors in loud and clear and firm terms about what their work does and does not imply or prove. They need to be able to speak boldly and confidently as the person who knows the most about the subject, to reject in clear terms the misappropriation of good scholarly work for bad political ends. In other words, they need to refuse to cede the intellectual discourse to bad actors. And they'll have to do so boldly and publicly if they're going to win the public argument. Otherwise, scholars may find themselves in a kind of intellectual ghetto while the public square is dominated by the eugenicists. If that occurs, then the public will become increasingly convinced by the eugenicists. In the face of bad actors, timidity is of no use. So intellectual humility, the virtue that it helps you avoid both arrogance and timidity, is important for contending with bad truths. I'm going to move on, but before I do so, I just want to emphasize that sometimes scholars weaponize the avoidance of timidity and the avoidance of arrogance in ways that undermine our credibility. So I just want to say something about how that works. So sometimes when the truth is good, we encourage ourselves and our colleagues to avoid timidity. We say, speak boldly and confidently. You're the expert on this issue, right? Because the truth is good. But then when the truth is bad, we encourage ourselves and our colleagues to avoid arrogance. We say, well, be patient. Maybe the results of the study don't prove what you think they prove. We become very cautious about what conclusions can and cannot be drawn from this limited set of data or this new philosophical argument. And the worry is that if we don't apply the same standards to good truths and bad truths alike, then we can reasonably be accused of putting our thumbs on the scale. I'll come back to this topic in my conclusion, but I confess that it's a problem that I don't have a well worked out view on. I want to turn now to the limits of courage, free speech, and intellectual humility in confronting bad truths today. I think the main limitation of these approaches is that they don't sufficiently account for how the academy relates to the broader world. To see this, let's begin with a metaphor so ubiquitous that it's often used interchangeably with academia: the ivory tower. The metaphor conveys a space for scholarship that's elevated and isolated from the broader world in which the scholar is situated. I'll have more to say about the limits of this metaphor later, but I just want to start with some data points that should give you reason to think that if the ivory tower metaphor was ever instructive, things are changing. The separation between the academy and the world is in some sense smaller than it's ever been. Okay, so who knows what percentage of Americans 25 and older today have earned a college degree? Does anyone have a hunch about what that number might be? Yeah, go ahead. 87? It's not quite that high, but it is high. Yeah, go ahead. You all are, this is because this is a university, and you all are educated and smart, and you're around educated and smart people. For those of us from less educated and smart communities, that would be a surprise. So it's actually like a little under 40%. It's 37%. So that means you all are like the elite. You're the cream of the crop. Okay, so 37% of Americans 25 and older today have earned a college degree. What do you think that number was in the 1960s? It was less than 8%. It was 7.7%. So that means like 5 times the number of Americans today are graduating college than did 60 years ago. In fact, today about 14% of Americans have gotten some kind of advanced degree, over 14%, which means that twice as many Americans today have advanced degrees than went to college at all in the 1960s. So this should maybe give a sense of like how the academic landscape has changed just in the United States over the last 60 years. That's more Americans who are interacting with academic work, who are learning about how academics conduct and discuss our research. Furthermore, you no longer need direct access to a university to read an academic paper. You might be able to purchase access online, or if you're lucky, your local library might have digital access. And more academics are publishing preprints on their websites. The number of open access journals is still pretty low, but it's increasing. And I take it, though I can't speak from personal experience here, that social media like Twitter and Substack provide opportunities for academics to communicate with the broader public. I saw a video recently where my old teacher, Liz Harmon, was explaining her views on abortion to James Franco. And that video I checked last week has nearly 800,000 views on YouTube, which I recognize is small potatoes in the age of Baby Shark and Despacito. But the fact that hundreds of thousands of people listen to this like ivory tower philosopher give her view on an urgently important matter in the public discourse is, at least to me, kind of mind-blowing, right? The ivory tower isn't this isolated thing the way you might have thought. I think that pressures against promulgating bad truths in a way that maybe those pressures have never really existed or have not existed in this way. So here's an example that I think is especially striking. It's a gentleman named John DiIulio. So DiIulio is a well-respected political scientist. He holds an endowed chair in political science at the University of Pennsylvania. And before that, he taught politics and public policy at Princeton for 13 years. Now, in the 1990s, he wrote an article in the recently defunct conservative political magazine, The Weekly Standard. In that article, he distilled some of the research that he and some of his colleagues had been conducting. They argued that America was going to soon see the rise of what they called super predators. A super predator, they said, is a person who is willing to commit violent crimes without remorse. Super predators, he argued, were responsible for disproportionate numbers of crimes. And DiIulio argued that those super predators are rare. They're more common among young minority men. DiIulio then predicted that the rise of super predators would lead to a large increase in violent crime. So all this is happening in the early 1990s. Now, as you might know, the super predator theory ended up being pretty important for legitimating especially broad and punitive 1990s crime bills that were passed in states all over the United States. And those crime bills are now, I think, generally seen as not only a policy failure, but also especially harmful for blacks and other minorities. Many of these bills allowed for juveniles to be tried as adults and even given life sentences without the possibility of parole. In some states, 14-year-olds could be tried as adults and sentenced to life in prison. Corrections data analyzed by the nonprofit group Phillips Black found that 2/3 of the juveniles who received life sentences are black. DiIulio surely had no intention of contributing to policies that harm children, especially black children, right? That wasn't his goal. He felt that he had done good scholarship and that his work, though perhaps troubling, could shape public policy in socially beneficial ways. But his example concretizes the risks of promulgating bad truths. Incredibly detrimental policies were justified in part by reference to a social scientist's honest attempts to face up to what he thought were bad truths. And I think the DiIulio example highlights some of the limitations of the 3 responses to bad truths that I mentioned earlier. So imagine that you're a social scientist working today, and you conduct some research, and it seems to confirm that some bad truth is true. But you have the DiIulio case in the back of your mind, right? Well, your resistance to promulgating your research, it's probably not going to be softened by the fact that there's like a free speech culture at your university. Because you're not worried really about being prevented from speaking. You're worried about the consequences of your speech for others. Indeed, you might even think that free speech cultures do more harm than good. You might think that perhaps if DiIulio hadn't spoken so freely, fewer people would have suffered. The virtue of courage is also orthogonal, I think, to the DiIulio case. So courage, remember, helps you persist in doing good at great personal cost. But the DiIulio example teaches us that the costs of telling bad truths aren't always borne primarily by the person telling the truth. When the consequences of your action fall on other people, not on yourself, courage starts to feel like the wrong virtue. Think of that classic of modern film, Shrek, where Lord Farquaad exhorts his men to a dangerous mission by saying, "Some of you may die, but that's a sacrifice I am willing to make." Right? What about intellectual humility? Okay, so at first it might seem like this is the right solution to the DiIulio problem. Today, most social scientists feel that, or agree, I should say, that DiIulio's arguments weren't right. DiIulio himself has, in recent years, been a lot more circumspect about his claims. So what if he had collected more data, tried different methods? What if he had been more skeptical about his findings? What if he had given his colleagues more time to criticize or chasten or even refute his research? Would that have helped? Maybe. The problem is you can't know in advance whether the best thing to do is to be cautious or bold without knowing in advance whether you're correct. So here's what I mean. Suppose that DiIulio had been right. Suppose that the US really was on the verge of a massive crime spike, and he had come up with evidence that would not only explain this, but give lawmakers an opportunity to nip it in the bud. It would surely have been his responsibility to get that information out to anyone who would listen. If states could craft good public policy, good laws in response to his predictions, they might have been able to save thousands, tens of thousands of people from being victimized by these so-called super predators. Right? The problem isn't that DiIulio had or lacked intellectual humility. The problem is that he was wrong. But we can't know that he was wrong in advance. And that's the rub. Intellectual humility tells you to avoid arrogance and to avoid timidity, but it won't determine for you in advance which is the more dangerous error to fall into. So that's the first limit. Here's another limit. As early as 1996, so this is just 2 or 3 years after he published his op-ed, DiIulio had started to worry that the term super predator had, in his words, sort of gotten out and gotten away from me. A lie, it said, gets halfway around the world before the truth has gotten its shoes on. A bad truth, or in this case, a bad falsehood as well. The internet age makes this problem especially challenging because the timelines for correction are really, really fraught. If a bad truth gets itself onto Twitter, it's going to be really hard to correct it before millions of people have already believed it. So intellectual humility is important, but it's not clear to me that it's especially well suited to help mitigate the social costs of bad truths. So I've sketched out an account of what makes truths bad and discussed some of the standard responses that people offer to the what if the truth is bad question, and some of the limits of these responses. Now I want to think about some more strategies. Necessarily, what I say is going to be speculative. But I think that giving a sort of picture of the world in which bad truths could be discussed openly might be instructive for us. So first, one of the worries that people have about bad truths is that if you promulgate them, you're going to harm others. And in a society where everyone enjoyed robust protections of their freedom and welfare, the risks of promulgating bad truths would be considerably lower. DiIulio's research was dangerous for poor blacks in general, and especially poor black men, in large part because poor blacks often already suffer significant precarity in the US. If they suffered no such precarity, his research would have been less consequential for them. Right? This is a point I think worth belaboring. There are some bad truths whose promulgation will always be risky for already vulnerable populations. The only way to promulgate them without risk is for these populations to be vulnerable no longer. In other words, the virtues and goals that we wish to uphold in the academy, the pursuit of wisdom, knowledge, and understanding, are radically dependent on the achievement of political goals beyond the academy, the protection of everyone from vulnerability and precarity. Now, scholars have known for a long time that we depend on the broader public for our continued existence. We work at universities that receive public funds. Many of those universities are also tax exempt, which puts us, in some sense, at the mercy of governments who could tax us but choose not to. And some proposed and other actualized legal changes in Texas and Florida and Indiana have challenged tenure, which many scholars see as fundamental to academic freedom. These are topics that rightly have gotten a great deal of attention. But what I'm proposing here is that there are further points of contact between the university and the broader public whose implications have not been fully appreciated. If promulgating bad truths can put vulnerable populations at risk, then it will be very difficult for any scholar whose conscience forces them to be concerned about those vulnerable populations to devote serious intellectual time and energy to analyzing those bad truths. In other words, regions that might have otherwise been ripe for pursuit in wisdom, knowledge, and understanding are likely to go unstudied or understudied as long as vulnerable populations exist. This is, I think, a significant way in which academic scholarship depends on public justice. Our concern for better understanding bad truths is predicated on public reform. Quite literally, unless the world is changed, we will not be able to inquire full-throatedly into bad truths. There can be no fully free inquiry at all so long as the world is unjust, because free inquiry will always threaten to put vulnerable populations at risk. This is a crucial respect in which the work we do depends on the justice of the societies we live in. So that's the first proposal. I start off with it because it's the most radical and it's the most unachievable. The poor will always be with you, someone once said, I think. But I also think it's worth emphasizing because I'd like for you to interpret everything else I say in light of the scope of the first proposal. I shouldn't even call it a proposal because fix everything is not concrete. Everything else I'm going to say, however important, is I think more marginal. Remembering the scope and fundamentality of the first point can help us appreciate the marginality of the other two. So here's the second suggestion. I started off by presenting my liberal bona fides to you. I framed it as a joke, which, let the record show, everyone laughed at. But I did so not just sort of to tell a really funny joke, but also to communicate to you all that you can trust me. I am not looking to use bad truths to harm vulnerable populations. You would, I think, be responding to this talk differently if you had reason to believe that I am one of those eugenicists. Right? If we knew that no one who engages bad truths will attempt to use them for bad ends, which is to say, if we trusted people within and beyond the academy, promulgating bad truths would feel less risky. We need communities of trust within the academy and between the academy and the world to make room for bad truths. Many others, far more intelligent than I have written about how to build this kind of trust. I'm happy to learn more from you about this in the Q&A. But I have two thoughts that I'd like to offer. One is about our relationship with the broader public within the academy, and then the other is about our relationship with one another within the academy. So it seems to me that part of the distrust that the broader public has about the academy is the perception that scholars are willing to distort or conceal the truth when we think it's bad. And there's also this perception I mentioned earlier that we put our thumb on the scale with respect to intellectual humility. In these two ways, I think it sometimes feels to the public like scholars are cheating. So I'm not in a position to say in general whether these perceptions are valid, but I do think that insofar as the public has them, they're going to have a hard time trusting us. And so we should work hard to dispel this perception. The best way to do so is just to be very clear that we're not putting our thumbs on the scale, that we're not distorting, concealing, or lying about bad truths. That is to say, it may be the case that the best way to rebuild public trust with respect to bad truths is to just be honest about when the truth looks bad. Now let me say something about our relationship within the academy to one another. This is going to be less relevant for the students who are not pursuing masters or PhDs or anything, but I want to say it anyway. So one thing I've noticed in my short time in higher education is that academics are capable of something that approximates hatred for one another. I'm told that this hatred is more salient online. Insofar as hatred and trust are mutually exclusive, it would be worth understanding why we hate each other so much. Here's a hypothesis. So many of us are driven people. We care deeply about our work, and some of us care deeply about the world. But like most people, we are ineffectual. We're weak. We're powerless even to change the unjust world we live in. We can't control it. Well, we can't control the world, so what can we control? Well, to some degree, scholars can control their smaller academic communities. I think that sometimes our frustrations about our powerlessness are translated into a desire to enforce the justice that's missing from the world within those smaller communities. In other words, our powerlessness motivates a kind of petty tyranny. Anyone who has spent time with young children has seen this happen to them. I have a 16-month-old daughter, and she has started to become aware of and frustrated by her powerlessness. And that frustration bears out, it seems, in fierce and desperate attempts to to assert what little control she has. That is, in part, what a tantrum is. The cry of the powerless child, the powerless child, attempting to exert control over a frustrating and confusing world. Here's the kicker. It's not just my daughter who does this. It's actually me, her dad. So as she gets older, and as I get older too, I guess, I become increasingly unable to force her to do what I want her to do. And I notice that this creeping powerlessness tricks me and tempts me to try and force her or exert control over her, parts of her life that I can still control for now. Powerlessness doesn't just trick her into petty tyranny. It tricks me into petty tyranny as well. Recognizing that dynamic in myself has actually been pretty helpful. It's a good diagnostic test for thinking about when I'm parenting in a strict way for her good and for our family's good, as opposed to just trying to exert control because I'm frustrated and powerless. She's too young to perform the kind of reflective exercise that I just described, but if I and my wife, her mom, do our jobs right, hopefully our daughter will be able to do this when she's older. So here's what I'm suggesting. A lot of academic infighting is just a more sophisticated version of that thing that I just described. I don't mean this in a demeaning way. Rather, I mean that petty tyranny is a normal human response to powerlessness. Recognizing this can be instructive in two ways. First, when you recognize your petty tyranny, it can be an occasion to pursue power in just and fair ways. Rather than trying to dominate a small academic community, we could try to confront the forces that make us feel powerless instead. We should get organized. Second, recognizing one's own petty tyranny should inspire us to step back and let go and treat one another as sites of authority, as equals. Rather than trying to dominate one another, which is both difficult and useless, we can pursue trust and common ends. We can get a lot more done if we work together. We'd be less powerless, I should say, and more humane. So that's a second strategy, right? Building trust within and beyond the academy. Here's a third strategy. It will be useful, I think, for scholars to embrace contingency. Here's what I mean. I argued earlier on that bad truths are bad because they corrode some things that we find valuable. But it's possible that the relationships between the truths, the facts that we're worried about, and the things that we value are contingent rather than necessary. We don't have to just accept that the facts will corrode the goods we value. We can shape the relationship between the truths and the things we value. In other words, we can actually make bad truths good, or at least we can make them benign. We can choose what we do with the facts. So for instance, let's say you're worried that differences in intelligence or rationality might undermine our commitments to moral equality in an ethnically or racially pluralized society. One lesson that you could draw from this is that we just place way too much emphasis on intelligence and rationality when we think about equality. Right? We don't have to ground moral and political equality in equalities of certain traits. We might be able to find alternative grounds for moral and political equality, or we might treat moral equality as a fundamental fact. We might commit ourselves to it come what may. Were we to do so, differences in traits wouldn't have to undermine our commitments to moral equality. Moral equality would just mean equality regardless. There's plenty of historical precedent for the kind of rejiggering of the relationship between the facts and the politics that I'm describing. Let me tell you about one figure that I've been thinking and writing about recently, 16th and 17th century Jesuit priest and jurist and legal theorist named Francisco Suarez. So one question that Suarez considered was the permissibility of forcibly enslaving Native Americans. This was a debate that had been sort of raging in Spain for like the previous about 100, 120 years. And 50 years before Suarez took up this question, a Dominican friar named Bartolomé de las Casas had debated publicly with a philosopher named Juan Gines de Sepulveda about this question. Right? And Las Casas had argued that Native Americans are capable of self-rule. He'd actually spent a great deal of time living with Native Americans and had written an entire kind of anthropology. And he said, look, their societies are as sophisticated and complex and rich culturally as ours. It's plain that the Native Americans are capable of self-rule. And for this reason, Las Casas said, Native Americans ought not to be forcibly enslaved. Sepulveda didn't have the facts on his side, but he still argued that actually Native Americans aren't capable of self-rule, and for this reason they ought to be enslaved, right? So they disagreed about the permissibility of forcibly enslaving Native Americans, and this disagreement reflected the broader debate going on in the Spanish intelligentsia. But notice that for all of their disagreements, they actually agreed on the following claim, that the right against enslavement depends on your capacity for self-rule. Right? Las Casas was saying they can rule themselves, so we shouldn't enslave them. Sepulveda was saying they can't rule themselves, so we should. But they were basically just agreeing that if you can't rule yourself, you can be enslaved. Right? So with respect to this debate, I think Suarez's contribution was stunning. So he argued that the Native Americans probably were capable of ruling themselves. Right? He said, yeah, they probably are capable of self-rule. But he thought that this factual question was was up for grabs, and he was happy to concede that maybe some Native Americans aren't capable of self-rule. He didn't think this was unique to Native Americans, I should say. He was explicit. He said, well, whatever standard we determine, by which we determine that some Native Americans aren't capable of self-rule, it's probably also going to force us to admit that some Europeans aren't capable of self-rule, right? So Suarez didn't think that this was sort of a unique Native American thing. He thought this was probably true kind of worldwide. But Suarez denied that whether you can rule yourself just has any bearing whatsoever on whether it's okay to enslave you. He instead argued that everyone, in virtue of being God's property, enjoys a right against forcible enslavement. It doesn't matter, Suarez says, if you're capable of self-rule or not. Forcible enslavement is impermissible for those who belong to God. Suarez, good Jesuit that he was, held that everyone belongs to God. The capacity for self-rule, he said, isn't relevant to the moral and legal question of who can be enslaved. So in other words, Suarez was trying to disrupt the connection between the question, is this person capable of self-rule, and the question, may we forcibly enslave them? And I think this is a kind of really instructive disruption. Perhaps when confronted by bad truths, our strategy should be to try and think of modes of disrupting their connection to bad moral and political programs, rather than taking the assumed connection for granted. So that's the third strategy. All right, let me sum up real quick. So I've argued that a bad truth is a truth that opposes some good we value by corroding, undermining, or defeating commitments that are connected to those goods. And I've claimed that we can't respond to them with noble lies, and that while we need free speech and courage and intellectual humility, none of these values and virtues are sufficient. The reason they aren't sufficient is that many of the bad truths that threaten, or that most scholars that most scholars are worried about, are those that threaten to harm vulnerable populations outside the academy. And intellectual humility, courage, and free speech are all ways of equipping those of us within the academy to tell the truth wisely and boldly. They aren't sufficient to help those who are most vulnerable outside the academy. The fears we have about bad truths, I've suggested, will never be fully assuaged as long as vulnerable populations remain. And so the only true fix to the problem is to fix the world. In this respect, I want to emphasize again, there can be no fully free inquiry in an unjust society. That's because in an unjust society, there will always be a legitimate fear that free inquiry will make life worse for the least well-off. The line between the academy and the world is porous. Between now and heaven, I think, however, we can pursue other strategies. We can build and rebuild trust between the academy and the broader public and amongst academics. We can embrace contingency. I want to end with a question that I have, a question that I hinted at earlier. So one thing I notice in myself is that I have higher standards for whether I'm going to believe bad truths as opposed to good ones. For instance, one of the bad truths I mentioned earlier, if it were true, is that monarchies and oligarchies lead to better political outcomes, right? So suppose someone presented me with some evidence that that's true, that, you know, got these like terrible societies and said actually everyone there is like happier and like people are flourishing and there's less violence. My own inclination, just to speak confessionally, is that I would probably, given my limited skills, try to comb through the data and be really, really skeptical and, you know, and then question everything. And I just wouldn't have the same approach if someone produced data that said like the more free and equal a society, the happier people are. Right? It takes a lot more convincing for me to believe a bad truth than a good one. And I suggested earlier, and I still think it's possible that this is a mistake, even a vice in me. If in general our ordinary beliefs should follow the evidence, then it seems to me that I should just have the same evidentiary standard for good truths and bad truths. But that's not how I live. And it's not even how I'd want to live. I suspect that others have the same kind of feeling as well. Is this a mistake? Perhaps. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Professor Alimi, for a wonderful talk. We have plenty of time for questions.
Thank you for your talk. It was brilliant. One question I had in regard to the three possible ways to respond to bad truths. The idea came to me as you're presenting those three possible ways. What if someone is ignorant? And I wondered if, you know, and their actions follow their sort of subconscious to which they're not actually reflecting on or thinking about these bad truths. Would that qualify as handling them badly, or is that potentially a different, you know, scenario?
Oh, that's really nice. So, can I just ask as a quick follow-up, are they ignorant? They're ignorant that the thing that they sort of know the truth or the alleged truth, but they're just ignorant about its badness?
Yeah, I'm thinking of the person on the other end of the Twitter feed, you know, that sees the tweet that goes with it. So they're not necessarily ignorant of the Twitter post, right? They are aware of the Twitter post, but they're ignorant of any of this conversation of good truths, bad truths. They're not an academic. They're just a common person living their lives with a bad truth.
That's super helpful. Yeah, so that's right. So I kind of set it up in this really reflective way that everyone who's interacting with a bad truth sort of is like, you confront it and you realize it's bad, and so you either ignore it or you kind of handle it in this sloppy way, or you really handle it in this like robust and responsible way. But as you're suggesting, that's not necessary. Someone could bump up against a bad truth and not really have any clear conception of how the fact maps on to what goes on in the real world. So what should I say about them? Are they ignoring it? Are they mishandling it? Or are they handling it well? I think the right answer is none of those. So I think what you're helping me to do is clarify that what I mean is that when someone bumps up against a truth or a fact, and they realize that it has this connection to, or that it corrodes this connection to a good, then there are like these three ways to respond. But for people who don't recognize the potential connection, there are probably tons of other ways to respond. You could, like, as you say, you read it on Twitter, you're like, huh, and then move on. Or you could talk about it with your friends, or you could read more, right? So then the sort of range of potential response is a lot broader. Yeah, thank you for that. That's really helpful.
Other questions?
Thank you. So one very obvious objection that occurs to me is with your first point about changing the world. I see the reason a lot of people academics try to downplay or not say bad truths is just that they view it as cutting against changing the world, especially in a highly polarized political environment. So it's kind of obvious, right? But what would you say to that kind of objection?
Yeah, that's really good. So I said that we can't fix the problem unless we change the world. But I also said you can't do the noble lie thing and you can't hide the truth. But you might think that the noble lie is the only way to change the world. So there are two lessons, I think, to draw from this tension that you've really helpfully borne out. So I said that justice doesn't require truth. And then I said, well, for Plato, justice doesn't require truth. And the reason I corrected myself is that I actually think justice probably does require truth. And so what I think is that these two tensions must be brought into coherence with one another. So that insofar as we're lying for the sake of justice or whatever, we're actually also probably undermining justice in most instances. And so the means actually undermine the political ends. Now, I didn't want to commit myself to that in the talk because, who am I to stand up against Plato? But that is actually where I stand. So that's the first thing. Here's the second thing. We can ask the question, or I can address the question in a much more kind of pragmatic way. Tell me, you scholar who thinks that you can lie for the greater good, how often that has actually worked, especially in the modern period when your intellectual opponents within the academy have a lot of incentive to catch you in a lie. And that if you get caught in a lie, your reputation is harmed, your political project is harmed, the people who didn't trust you will trust you even less. Coalition building is going to require moving beyond the kind of 45-10 political split that we seem to see in America today. Strategically, why in the world would you think that this sort of attitude of deception is actually going to help you achieve your political ends? Has it? Or is it just contributing to more division and less trust and making it harder to work together for the kind of world that we might want to build? So that's more sort of my pragmatic response, aside from the sort of more theoretical response that I don't actually agree with the bifurcation of justice and truth. Yeah, thanks for that.
Just follow up really quickly and maybe tie it to your point about powerlessness, and maybe, as scholars, as academics, one of the things we think we can control is discourse. So maybe that's tied into this as well. And so if we're trying to change the world, what would we do other than discourse, controlling discourse, right?
Yeah, that's right. So that's a great point. So we think we can control the discourse, we can't. And so we exercise petty tyranny over the discourse. Well, there's lots of stuff we can do. We can tell the truth. We can't control the discourse. We can actually tell the truth. We tend to be, one thing that scholars are pretty good at is rationalization, I think. And that means that we can imagine different connections. And we actually can be pretty creative at imagining different connections between the facts and the politics. So we could promulgate those possibilities, sort of those imaginative possibilities. We can also, we're academics, but we're also just humans. We can get organized. We can work together. We can learn. I mean, we're typically kind of good at learning. We can learn from examples of communities that have organized for justice, oftentimes without lying and deception, right? So there are actually lots of things that we can do aside from lying, and I think it's a failure of imagination when scholars think the only thing I can do to make the world a better place is to tell a lie. I think it's, we probably haven't thought hard enough about the politics yet. Yeah, thank you.
I'll ask a question. I really, really enjoyed the talk and found it super interesting and really thoughtful. I think I also, though, have some pretty big questions that still linger over it. And I think one is that I'm not sure I understand what a bad truth is or whether the account holds together. So here are three things that are true. The climate is getting hotter. COVID exists. I will die. All three of those things seem like bad truths. And it seems that almost any truth in the right context could seem like a bad truth. And so I guess I start wondering, whether in your step 2, where you suggested the only way to resist the idea that there were bad truths was to be to hold to the unity of the transcendentals, whether there isn't a kind of conflation there between truth as a proposition and on the one hand, or a commitment on the one hand, and the state of affairs to which that corresponds on the other. That is, it's a bad thing that there is racism or COVID or cancer or death or so on. But it seems that the badness of those things is distinct from the fact that commitments or claims about those things are true. And it seems to me that as you try to give them the account of the badness of truth in general, that it ends up resting entirely on the movement from the speculative to the practical. That is, it's when the truths become practical, that is, premises for some kind of action, that their badness emerges. And so then your move is to, let's disentangle these. But I guess I'm wondering if they ever needed to be tangled to begin with. That is, if we could say that truth as such is good to, it's good to know the truth. I don't know. There's a lot there, but I just wanted to hear your reflections on that. And it's a sloppy, messy question. It's like a buffet question.
Yeah, that's helpful. So it's a buffet, so I'm going to take what I want and then leave the stuff that's too difficult to answer. So I think you're right. So let's look at the 3 examples. The climate's getting hotter, COVID exists, and each of us will die. I think, let me start with the last one. Each of us will die. There's a sense in which that's clearly bad. But actually, there are some people who have kind of made that for themselves, like, not actually that bad a truth. I will die is roughly like, for them, I'm going to wake up tomorrow morning. It's just that for them, it's like, I'm going to wake up tomorrow morning in a better place, say. And that doesn't mean that you have to like hasten your impending demise, but it does mean that you don't have to be worried about it. So there is that kind of disruption of the like apparently bad thing, or the connection of the apparently bad thing with anything that you actually have to be like worried about or set yourself against. What I think that people in these kinds of communities are doing is they're doing precisely what I suggest at the end of the paper. They're disrupting the connection between the fact of the matter and how we need to feel about it, or what follows from the fact of the matter. And I think we can do something similar, but it's more complicated for the climate is getting hotter, and something similar for COVID exists. So I think you're right that so the unity of the transcendentals piece, right? I think it's probably the case that it's always, is it always good to know the truth? It's probably the case that for most ordinary, let's say non-experiential truths or something like that, for propositional truths, it is probably the case that it's always good in some respect to know them. But that doesn't, it doesn't follow from that they have any sort of, that the practical upshot of knowing it is like, is good or bad, or the practical upshot of the fact itself is good or bad. So I appreciate the like separation of the medieval theory to what we kind of on the ground mean by bad truths. Does that start to answer? If you want to come back.
Yeah,
to it,
no. I think that's right. And I mean, there's certain truths that that firsthand, like here's one sort of bad truth that I think makes sense as a category. Truth, the acquisition of which requires doing something evil.
That's right.
All right? Or truth, the acquisition of which requires the unnecessary suffering of another person, or something like that. But that seems very, it seems to me that the core of your talk circulates around the relationship between the speculative and the practical. And I think I think it's, as I said at the beginning, super, super interesting. And curious if anyone else, any students might have questions, or anyone else might. Yeah, go ahead.
Last thought from me, the higher epistemic standards for good and bad truths I found to be very interesting, and I appreciate your question to us. On the surface, I want to say that, I don't want to have higher epistemic standards for good truths, because that just seems like living a life that's just suspicious and unhelpful. But I also wonder about the connection between the skepticism among the public toward academic community, and if we did adopt more higher epistemic standards toward good truth, if that would actually align us a bit with the common person in a way that allows them to feel like we're doing our job, keeping these epistemic standards high kind of across the board, or whether they would just, thumb their nose at us that, look, they're doing absolutely nothing now. Look at the questions they're asking. So food for thought, pros and cons both ways.
That's super helpful. So let me give a really bad example. Not bad. Hopefully not bad in that it's like not illuminating, but bad because it's like it should like upset you. I am not skeptical when someone produces, like a sociologist or a social scientist produces results that says like, black people are like roughly as intelligent as white people, let's say. Okay, so I'm not skeptical of those kinds of results. Now, if I generally had higher epistemic standards for good truths, I would be especially skeptical of those results, but that now just makes me like something pretty close to a racist. And so one of my worries about like sort of having a general higher skepticism of good truths than bad truths is that you might unwittingly align yourself practically with communities that you don't want to align yourself with. So that's like the worry I have. But I think you're right that it's like those are the communities that are exactly the ones who are most skeptical of what's going on in the ivory tower, and that's the puzzle, right? I don't want to have to be a racist to convince the racist. There must be another way. that's kind of, so thanks for that.
All right, well, let's thank Dr. Alimi for a fascinating lecture.
Thank you all.